Inside the private hangar at Miami Executive Airport, the golden hour sun slanted through high windows, painting everything in shades of amber and copper. The light caught dust motes floating through the air like golden snow, transforming the cavernous space into something almost sacred. But Delphine McCool wasn't admiring the view. She was pushing her maintenance cart across the polished concrete floor, the wheels squeaking in a rhythm she'd memorized over 5 long years. Her navy coveralls bore the Caruso Enterprises logo, stitched in gold thread that caught the afternoon light, the same enterprise whose owner looked through her as if she were made of smoke. She paused near a tool rack, adjusting the cleaning supplies on her cart, watching the scene unfold 30 feet away with the detached interest of someone who'd learned long ago that staying invisible kept you safe. Dante Caruso stood beside his Gulfstream G650 like a man who didn't just own the aircraft. He owned the very air that filled the hangar. At 43, he carried himself with the kind of stillness that made people nervous, the kind of quiet that preceded storms. His suit was Brioni, hand-tailored in Naples, dark charcoal with subtle pinstripes that caught the light when he moved. No tie, the collar of his black shirt open just enough to suggest he answered to no dress code but his own. On his right hand, a platinum signet ring caught the light, engraved with a family crest most people wouldn't recognize but some would fear. 3 Asian investors flanked him, their designer suits and nervous energy marking them as men about to make a very large bet. Behind Dante, almost invisible in their stillness, stood 2 men. Rocco, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, his hands clasped in front of him, and Enzo, younger but equally quiet, his eyes constantly scanning the hangar. Neither wore uniforms. They didn't need to. Their presence said enough. "Gentlemen," Dante's voice was low, barely raised, but it carried across the space with the authority of someone who'd never had to shout to be heard. "This aircraft represents precision, speed, discretion." He placed one hand on the jet's hull, the gesture almost affectionate. "In 90 minutes, we'll be in Atlanta. The deal we finalize there will reshape private aviation in the Southeast." Delphine had heard variations of this speech countless times. She'd cleaned up after these meetings, emptied trash cans that smelled of expensive cigars and older whiskey, mopped floors where fortunes changed hands in handshakes and nods. Today should have been no different, except something in the air felt charged, heavy, like the moment before lightning transforms the sky. She maneuvered her cart carefully, trying to navigate around the group without drawing attention. In 5 years, she'd perfected the art of being invisible. But as she passed, her cart clipped a power cable. The metallic clang echoed through the hangar like a gunshot. Dante's head turned toward her, unhurried but absolute. His eyes were dark, almost black in the amber light, and they settled on her with the weight of a judge's gavel. He didn't speak immediately. The silence stretched, taut as wire. "People forget their place," he said finally, his voice pitched to carry to the investors but directed at her. "Then they learn." The investors shifted uncomfortably. One studied his phone with sudden intensity. Another cleared his throat, but none spoke. In Dante Caruso's world, you didn't interrupt. You didn't defend. You waited to see what happened next. Delphine's hands tightened on the cart handle until her knuckles ached. 5 years she'd endured comments like this. 5 years of being less than furniture in their eyes. The old Delphine, Captain McCool, who'd commanded respect at 30,000 feet, would have responded differently. But that woman had been grounded by grief, buried under tragedy that still haunted her dreams. "My apologies, Mr. Caruso," she said, her voice steady as steel despite the fire burning in her chest. She'd barely taken 3 steps when chaos erupted behind her. "Said that, Mr. Caruso." Harrison, Dante's personal pilot, suddenly clutched his stomach and doubled over near the aircraft stairs. His face drained of color as he stumbled, catching himself against the jet's hull. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his breathing labored. "Harrison." Enzo moved forward instantly, his hand disappearing inside his jacket before Harrison waved him off. "Food poisoning," Harrison gasped, his voice thin with pain. "That seafood lunch. I can't. I can barely stand, let alone fly." The hangar fell silent except for Harrison's labored breathing and the distant hum of aircraft on nearby runways. Delphine watched Dante's face remain perfectly still, but something flickered in his eyes. Not panic. Men like Dante Caruso didn't panic. But calculation, cold and rapid. "Get me another pilot," he said to Rocco, his tone unchanged, as if this were a minor inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. Now, Rocco already had his phone out, his fingers moving across the screen with surprising speed for such large hands. His voice grew more clipped with each call. "Jenkins is in Orlando. Patterson's in Houston. Rodriguez is—" He paused, listening. "On vacation. Sir, the nearest available pilot is 3 hours away." 3 hours? For the first time, something cracked in Dante's composure. Not much, just a hairline fracture in the marble facade. "The meeting is in 90 minutes. If we're not there, the deal dies." 2.8 billion, one of the investors said, his Mandarin accented English careful. "That is the number we agreed upon. If we miss this window—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The weight of that number hung in the air like the puro smoke that often filled this hangar after dark, when different kinds of deals were made. Delphine set down her mop bucket. The sound rang through the hangar like a bell, clear and final. "I can fly it." Every head turned toward her. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that precedes earthquakes. Dante's expression shifted from surprise to assessment, finally settling on something that might have been amusement if it weren't so cold. "You." He didn't quite laugh, but the word carried mockery like a blade carried an edge. "The cleaning woman." He began to circle her slowly, his movements deliberate, taking in her stained coveralls, her work boots, the ID badge that simply read, "Maintenance Staff, McCool, D." The investors watched with confusion. Rocco's hand remained near his jacket. Enzo's eyes narrowed, evaluating threat levels. "You probably can't even spell Gulfstream," Dante continued, playing to his audience now, his voice carrying that particular tone wealthy men used when they wanted to remind everyone of the hierarchy. "What makes you think you could handle a $70 million aircraft? I can fly your jet," Delphine repeated, stepping forward into the circle of light cast by the hangar's overhead lamps. Her voice didn't rise, didn't waver. "Unless you'd prefer to lose your deal." Dante's jaw tightened, the first genuine emotion she'd seen crack his facade. He glanced at his watch, a vintage Patek Philippe that probably cost more than most houses, then at his investors, then back at Delphine. When he smiled, it was the smile of a man about to enjoy watching someone fail. "You know what?" He turned to address everyone in the hangar, ground crew, investors, his own men. "Let's make this interesting." He took a step closer to Delphine, near enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive and subtle, mixed with the faint scent of cigar smoke that clung to his clothes. "Fly this jet successfully, and maybe I'll make you an honest offer." He paused, his smile widening just slightly. "But we both know you'll fail, and when you do, you're done, not just here, everywhere. You'll never work at another airport in this state. I'll make sure of it." Some of the ground crew looked away. Others stared in disbelief. The investors exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events, but unwilling to interfere in Dante Caruso's world. Delphine held his gaze for a long moment, 5 years of silence finally reaching its breaking point. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the inner pocket of her coveralls and withdrew a small leather wallet, worn soft from years of handling. From it, she pulled a card she hadn't shown anyone since the day she'd taken this job. Her airline transport pilot license gleamed under the hangar lights. Current, valid, with type ratings for multiple aircraft, including the Gulfstream G650. The smile vanished from Dante's face like smoke and wind. Without waiting for his response, Delphine walked toward the aircraft. Her work boots echoed against the concrete, each step measured and certain. She climbed the stairs and entered the cockpit, her hands finding familiar positions on controls she'd once known better than her own heartbeat. Behind her, she heard Rocco's voice, low and urgent. "Sir, should we stop her? This could be—" "No." Dante's voice cut through like a knife. "Let her off buying. When she can't even start the engines, we'll all know where we stand." But Delphine's fingers were already dancing across the overhead panel, beginning the startup sequence with the muscle memory of 8,000 flight hours. She wasn't the invisible janitor anymore. She was Captain Delphine McCool, and she was about to remind everyone what that meant. The first engine spooled up with a rising whine that built to a satisfying roar. Then the second. The sound filled the hangar, drowning out everything else, powerful and undeniable. Through the cockpit window, she saw Dante's face change. The confident mask cracking just enough to show the man beneath, someone who just realized he'd gravely miscalculated. And in his world, miscalculations were often fatal. The investors were already boarding, their phones out, recording everything. This flight would change everything. But first, she had a jet to fly and a dangerous man to humble. The engine's roar filled the cockpit as Delphine's hands moved across the controls with surgical precision. Each switch, each gauge, each indicator light was exactly where her muscle memory expected it to be. Through the windscreen, she could see Dante and his investors boarding, their faces a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Rocco stood at the bottom of the stairs, speaking into his phone, his eyes never leaving the aircraft. But as she adjusted the pilot seat and strapped in, Delphine wasn't in Miami anymore. She was back in Afghanistan 5 years ago, the Hindu Kush Mountains rising like ancient teeth against a dawn sky that bled red and gold. Phoenix 2 maintained altitude at Angels 30. Her voice had crackled through the radio that morning, confident and clear. Captain Delphine McCool, call sign Phoenix 1, leading a routine VIP transport mission. Her wingman, Major James Rocket Roberts, had laughed through the comm. Copy that, Phoenix 1. Another milk run for the diplomatic corps. Stay sharp, Rocket. These mountains don't forgive complacency. They'd flown together for 3 years. James had been more than her wingman. He'd been her brother in everything but blood. The only other black pilot in their squadron, he understood the weight they both carried, the need to be twice as good to get half the credit. He'd been there when she made history as the youngest black woman to achieve squadron commander. He'd stood beside her when generals pinned commendations to her dress blues. The mechanical failure had come without warning. One moment, Rocket's helicopter was flying in perfect formation. The next, his tail rotor assembly catastrophically failed. She'd watched, helpless, as his aircraft spiraled down into the valley below, spinning like a child's toy thrown by an angry god. His last words still haunted her dreams. Phoenix 1, tell my girls I love them. Delphine, then static. Delphine. Dante's sharp voice through the cockpit door snapped her back to the present. Pre-flight complete. Beginning taxi procedures, she responded, her professional tone giving nothing away. But her hands trembled slightly as she released the parking brake. 5 years since she'd sat in a cockpit with passengers depending on her. 5 years since she'd been responsible for lives other than her own. After Rocket's death, she tried to continue flying. The Air Force had cleared her of any fault. Mechanical failures happened. Equipment degraded. No one blamed her. But every time she lifted off, she saw his helicopter spinning down, heard his voice, felt the crushing weight of being the one who survived. The guilt ate at her like acid, dissolving her confidence from the inside out. Then came the second blow. 3 months after losing Rocket, she'd gotten the call while stationed at MacDill Air Force Base. Her partner Marcus and their 2-year-old daughter Zara had been hit by a drunk driver on Interstate 75. They died instantly, the Florida Highway Patrol told her, as if that somehow made it better. As if knowing they hadn't suffered could fill the crater their absence left in her chest. 2 devastating losses in 3 months. The universe had taken everyone she loved, everyone who mattered, while she remained untouched, unharmed, breathing when they couldn't. The survivor's guilt crushed her beneath its weight until she couldn't stand up anymore. She'd submitted her resignation the next day, walking away from 8,000 flight hours, from commendations and achievements, from the only career she'd ever wanted. The Air Force tried to talk her out of it, offered counseling, leave, reassignment, but she was done watching people die, done being responsible for lives when she couldn't protect the ones that mattered most. Tower, this is November 7-3 Alpha requesting clearance for taxi to runway 9 right. Delphine spoke into the radio, the professional phraseology returning like a forgotten language suddenly remembered. November 7-3 Alpha, cleared to taxi via taxiway Lima. Hold short of runway 9 right. She'd found the janitor position at Caruso Enterprises through a temp agency. No background check beyond the basics. No questions about her past. The night shift meant minimal human interaction. She could push her cart through empty hangars, be near the aircraft she still loved without having to fly them. It was penance and comfort wrapped in Navy coveralls. For 5 years, she'd been a ghost haunting the periphery of the aviation world. She'd watched pilots prep for flights, overheard their stories in break rooms, secretly studied new avionics systems during her shifts. She'd maintained her licenses using her savings, taking recertification courses online, booking simulator time at a training facility 2 hours away where no one knew her story. It was torture and therapy combined, keeping her skills sharp for a return she never thought would come. You actually know what you're doing. Dante's voice came through the intercom, surprise evident despite his attempt to sound neutral. Delphine didn't respond. She was too busy monitoring engine parameters, checking hydraulic pressures, verifying flight control responses. The Gulfstream responded to her touch like a well-trained thoroughbred, powerful, eager, waiting for direction. For the first time in 5 years, she felt the intoxicating mixture of responsibility and freedom that came with command of an aircraft. Tower November 73 Alpha holding short of runway 9 right, ready for departure. November 73 Alpha cleared for takeoff, runway 9 right, fly heading 090, climb and maintain 5,000. As she advanced the throttles, Delphine thought about the ID badge in her pocket, the one that read simply, maintenance staff. She thought about the countless nights she'd mopped these hangar floors, invisible to men like Dante Caruso, who built their empires on the assumption that people like her didn't matter, didn't have stories, didn't possess talents that could threaten their carefully constructed hierarchies. She thought about Rocket, about Marcus and Zara, about the woman she used to be before grief grounded her more effectively than any mechanical failure. The Gulfstream accelerated down the runway, and at precisely the right moment, the moment when years of training and instinct converged into a single decision, Delphine pulled back on the yoke. The aircraft lifted gracefully into the Florida sky, and for one perfect moment, the weight of 5 years fell away. She wasn't the janitor anymore. She wasn't the grieving survivor. She was Captain Delphine McCool, and she was exactly where she belonged. Behind her in the cabin, she heard the investors speaking excitedly in Mandarin, their phones out, recording everything. She knew this moment was being documented, that her revelation would soon spiral beyond anyone's control. Good. Let them see what happened when you underestimated someone based on their uniform, their job title, the color of their skin. November 7-3 Alpha, contact departure on 124.7. Switching to departure, 124.7. November 7-3 Alpha. As Miami fell away below them and the Gulfstream climbed toward cruising altitude, Delphine felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years. Purpose. This wasn't just about flying Dante's jet or proving him wrong. This was about reclaiming the pieces of herself she'd thought were lost forever, buried with Rocket in Afghanistan and Marcus and Zara in a Florida cemetery. The afternoon sun painted the clouds gold as they climbed through 10,000 feet. Somewhere up here, among these clouds she'd once called home, Rocket was watching. Marcus and Zara too. And for the first time since losing them, Delphine didn't feel like she was betraying their memory by being alive. She was honoring it by finally, truly flying again. The Gulfstream climbed through 15,000 feet, and with each foot of altitude, Delphine felt more of her old self returning. She reached up to the overhead panel, adjusting the cabin pressure and temperature with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. Through the reinforced cockpit door, she could hear movement in the cabin, footsteps, the murmur of voices, the particular quality of silence that suggested someone was working up the courage to enter. Miami Center, November 7-3, Alpha requesting flight level 350. November 7-3 Alpha cleared to flight level 350, no delays expected. She pulled back gently on the yoke, and the $70 million aircraft responded like an extension of her will. The Florida coastline fell away beneath them, the Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly eastward, painted gold by the afternoon sun. For 5 years, she'd watched jets like this take off from the ground, their navigation lights blinking as they disappeared into clouds she could no longer touch. Now she was among them again, master of this aluminum cathedral climbing toward heaven. The cockpit door opened. Dante stood there, his frame filling the doorway, his face a battlefield where arrogance and awe waged war. His tie was gone now. He must have loosened it and removed it in the cabin, and the top button of his shirt was undone. His perfect composure was cracking like drought-stricken earth. How? The word came out strained, as if pulled from somewhere deep in his chest where pride usually kept such questions locked away. Delphine didn't turn around. Her hands remained steady on the controls, her eyes scanning the instruments in the practice pattern that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training. Primary flight display, navigation display, engine instruments, systems status. The dance never stopped, even in conversation. How what, Mr. Caruso? How does a janitor know how to fly a Gulfstream? The same way powerful men learn to underestimate people, she replied, adjusting the autopilot heading with a subtle turn of a knob. Practice. She heard him step closer, could smell his cologne mixing with the distinct scent of pressurized cabin air. In the reflection of the windscreen, she watched him study the cockpit, taking in the complexity of controls she manipulated with casual expertise. The flight management system displaying their route, the weather radar showing clear skies ahead, the traffic collision avoidance system tracking nearby aircraft, all of it flowing through her consciousness like blood through veins. November 7-3, Alpha, contact Atlanta Center on 132.5. Atlanta Center on 132.5, November 7-3, Alpha. She switched frequencies with one hand while adjusting engine parameters with the other, each movement precise and economical. You're not just a pilot, Dante said, his voice quieter now, almost respectful, the tone of a man reassessing a situation he'd thought he understood. The way you handle this aircraft, you're military trained. Delphine finally glanced back at him. His dark eyes, which had earlier blazed with contempt and casual cruelty, now held something different. Not quite humility, men like Dante Caruso probably didn't possess that particular virtue, but the dawning recognition of a catastrophic miscalculation. Captain Delphine McCool, United States Air Force, retired, she said simply, then turned back to her instruments. 8,000 flight hours, 2,000 in Gulfstream specifically. I've flown generals, senators, foreign dignitaries. I've landed in sandstorms in Iraq and thunderstorms over the Pacific. She gestured at the calm skies ahead, the smooth ride, the perfect weather. This is a walk in the park. Behind Dante, she could see the investors pressed against the cabin windows, their phones capturing everything. One of them was clearly live streaming. She recognized the interface. The modern world's instant jury, witnessing Dante Caruso's humiliation in real time. Wait a minute. Dante moved to the co-pilot seat but didn't sit, as if the leather might burn him, as if taking that seat would acknowledge her authority in a way his pride still struggled against. Why were you cleaning my hangars? For a moment, Delphine considered telling him about Rocket, about the way his helicopter had spiraled into that Afghan valley, about Marcus and Zara, about the drunk driver who'd stolen her family and the time it took a light to change, about the grief that had grounded her more effectively than any mechanical failure, any review board, any physical injury ever could. But Dante Caruso hadn't earned that truth. He hadn't earned the privilege of understanding her pain, her survival, her choices. That's not your concern, she said instead, her voice professional, distant. Your concern should be your meeting in Atlanta, which will reach in approximately 42 minutes. She engaged the weather radar, studying a line of storms building to the west. Without hesitation, she keyed the radio. Atlanta Center, November 7-3, Alpha requesting deviation right of course, weather. November 7-3, Alpha approved as requested, advise when able to return to course. The Gulfstream banked gently right, smooth as silk, avoiding turbulence that would have bounced lesser pilots around like dice in a cup. Delphine had read the weather, anticipated the convection, and navigated around it with the foresight that came from years of studying the sky's moods. Dante gripped the doorframe as the aircraft turned, though there was nothing violent about the maneuver. The water in the glasses back in the cabin probably hadn't even rippled. The way you flew out of Miami, he said, the taxi, the takeoff, it was perfect. It was adequate, Delphine corrected. Perfection would have been achieving it without an audience recording my every move for social media. She could feel his stare, the weight of his reevaluation. 5 years she'd endured his dismissive glances, his muttered comments, his assumption that the color of her skin and the uniform she wore defined her worth, her capabilities, her place in his world. Now he was seeing her, really seeing her, and the cognitive dissonance was almost visible on his face. The marriage comment, he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. That was recorded. Along with your observation about people forgetting their place, Delphine finished for him, her tone matter-of-fact. Your investors have it all on video. I imagine it's already trending on social media. The algorithms love this kind of content. Powerful man humiliated by woman he underestimated. Very shareable. Through the windscreen, the Georgia landscape appeared, a patchwork quilt of green and brown stretching toward Atlanta's skyline, hazy in the distance. Delphine began the descent checklist, her hands moving with the same precision they'd shown at takeoff. She called Atlanta approach, received vectors for the ILS approach to runway 27, and began configuring the aircraft for landing. I could make problems disappear, Dante said suddenly, desperation creeping into his voice like water through a cracked foundation. Names, debts, futures, what's your price? It was the first truly honest thing he'd said to her, stripping away the corporate euphemisms to reveal the world he actually operated in. A world where problems were solved not in boardrooms, but in rooms without cameras, where discussions happened in low voices and solutions were permanent. Delphine laughed, a sound as sharp as breaking glass. Mr. Caruso, you just offered to marry me as a joke, as an insult designed to humiliate me in front of your business partners. You've spent 5 years treating me as less than human. And now, because I can fly your jet, because I'm about to cost you money and reputation, you want to buy my silence with threats disguised as offers. She lowered the landing gear, the mechanical sound filling the cockpit with its reassuring rhythm. 3 green lights confirmed. Gear down and locked. The Atlanta skyline grew larger, Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport spreading before them like a concrete invitation. November 7-3, Alpha cleared ILS runway 27 approach. Maintain 170 knots until Jambo. Cleared ILS 27, maintaining 170 until Jambo. November 7-3, Alpha. Dante stood, his hand on the cockpit door handle, but he didn't leave. For a man who'd built an empire on reading situations and people, on knowing when to push and when to retreat, he seemed paralyzed by uncertainty. You're going to destroy me, aren't you? Delphine engaged the autopilot's approach mode, watching as the aircraft captured the localizer and glide slope, beginning its precise descent toward the runway. Only then did she turn to face him fully. Mr. Caruso, you destroyed yourself the moment you decided someone's worth was determined by their uniform, their job title, the assumptions you made about who they were and what they could do. She turned back to the instruments, her hands light on the controls, ready to take over if needed. I'm just landing your plane. As the Gulfstream descended through 2,000 feet, the runway lights beckoning like stars fallen to earth, Dante Caruso finally understood. He hadn't just underestimated a janitor. He'd underestimated Captain Delphine McCool. And in his world, where information was currency and reputation was armor, that mistake would cost him everything. The Gulfstream descended through 1,000 feet, Atlanta's runway stretching ahead like a promise. Delphine's hands remained steady on the yoke, her breathing controlled even as 5 years of suppressed emotion threatened to overwhelm her. Through her headset, Atlanta Tower cleared them for landing, but she barely needed the confirmation. Every instinct, every hard-earned hour of experience told her exactly where she was in space and time. 500, she announced to no one in particular, following protocol even though she flew alone in the cockpit. The automated voice of the ground proximity warning system echoed her. 500. In the cabin behind her, silence had replaced the investor's excited chatter. She could feel Dante still hovering near the cockpit door, his presence like a storm cloud waiting to break. The weight of what was about to happen, the inevitable collision between his arrogance and her truth, filled the space between them like pressurized air. 100. Her voice remained steady, professional. The voice of a woman who'd landed aircraft in far worse conditions than a clear Georgia afternoon. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. The main wheels kissed the runway with barely a whisper, the kind of landing pilots called a greaser, where passengers often didn't realize they'd touched down until the engine's reverse thrust. Delphine deployed the thrust reversers and applied the brakes with measured precision, the $70 million aircraft responding to her commands like a trained dancer following a familiar partner's lead. November 7-3 Alpha, turn right at taxiway Delta, contact ground on 121.9. Right at Delta, ground on 121.9, November 7-3 Alpha. As she taxied toward the private terminal, Delphine caught sight of news vans already gathering near the FBO. Someone had leaked the live stream. Of course they had. In the 21st century, humiliation traveled at the speed of light, viral before the aircraft even landed. She brought the aircraft to a stop at the designated parking spot, her hands moving through the shutdown checklist with the same precision she'd shown throughout the flight. Engines off, electrical systems to ground power, parking brake set. Each action was a small goodbye to the cockpit she'd never thought she'd see again. Dante appeared in the doorway as she removed her headset. His face had lost all color, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been fear, not of her, but of what she represented, what her competence meant for his carefully constructed world. Delphine, he started, then stopped, and she realized it was the first time he'd used her actual name. About what I said earlier, she stood, turning to face him fully in the cramped cockpit space. 5 years of cleaning his jets, 5 years of invisibility, 5 years of minimum wage while he built his empire in the shadows of legitimate business. All of it had led to this moment. You mean your proposal? She kept her voice level, professional. The one where you offered to marry me if I could fly this jet? The one designed to humiliate me in front of your investors? I didn't mean, yes, you did. She stepped past him into the cabin where the investors sat, their phones still recording. You meant every word. You thought it was safe to mock me because you believed I was beneath you. Just the cleaning woman, as you so eloquently put it. One of the investors cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Ms. McCool, that was extraordinary flying, truly exceptional. She nodded at him but kept her attention on Dante. Mr. Caruso, to formally answer your proposal, I decline. I don't need to marry you or anyone else for success. I've already achieved more than you can imagine, and I did it on my own merit. Through the cabin windows, she could see reporters gathering, their cameras trained on the aircraft. The situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control, and everyone in the cabin knew it. However, Delphine continued, reaching into her coveralls to pull out her Caruso Enterprises ID badge. I do accept your other offer, the one about being fired. She dropped the badge on the leather seat. It landed with a soft sound that somehow felt deafening. Consider this my resignation, effective immediately. You can't just, Dante started. I can, and I am. She moved toward the cabin door, but turned back one more time. Oh, and Mr. Caruso, my attorney will be in contact regarding the hostile work environment I've endured for the past 5 years. We have extensive documentation, including today's events, which your investors so helpfully recorded. The lead investor, an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, stood up. Ms. McCool, would you consider flying for our company? We operate out of Hong Kong. We could use someone with your skills and character. Dante's face went from pale to crimson. You can't poach my pilot during my own business meeting. She just resigned, the investor pointed out calmly. And after what we've witnessed, I think we need to reconsider this entire merger. A man who treats employees this way, who makes such catastrophic judgment errors about the people who work for him, it raises serious concerns about leadership and corporate culture. Delphine descended the aircraft stairs into the Georgia afternoon, the humid air hitting her like a wall after the controlled environment of the cockpit. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended, cameras rolling, questions flying like bullets. Captain McCool, is it true you were working as a janitor? Will you be pressing charges? What made you reveal your identity today? She raised her hand for silence, and surprisingly, they gave it to her. 5 years of hiding had ended, and she found she had words that needed saying, words that had been building in her chest like pressure in a sealed cabin. For 5 years, I've cleaned aircraft at Caruso Enterprises while maintaining my pilot certifications in secret. I'm not the only overqualified person working jobs beneath their capability. We do it for many reasons: trauma, circumstances, systemic barriers, immigration status. What happened today shouldn't have been necessary to prove my worth. Behind her, she heard Dante exit the aircraft, trying to push through the crowd. His investors remained on the jet, their expressions unreadable, but their phones still out, still recording. Caruso made assumptions about me based on my appearance, my domain, my race, and my gender. Those assumptions have now cost him dearly. Let this be a lesson to everyone watching. Talent doesn't always come in the packages you expect. Excellence doesn't wear a uniform you can recognize at a glance. A reporter shouted, "What will you do now?" For the first time in 5 years, Delphine smiled genuinely, the expression transforming her face. "I'm going to fly again. On my own terms." She walked away from the aircraft, from Dante Caruso's sputtering attempts at damage control, from 5 years of hiding in plain sight. The afternoon sun was bright on her face, warm on skin that had spent too long in fluorescent-lit hangars. Somewhere above, she could hear another jet climbing into the sky. Soon, she promised herself. Soon she'd be up there again. But first, she had a hostile work environment lawsuit to file and job offers to consider. The aviation world had just been reminded that Captain Delphine McCool existed, and she intended to make sure they never forgot it again. Behind her, Dante Caruso's carefully constructed empire began its descent, as inevitable as gravity, as precise as her landing had been. She'd given him the chance to see her as human, as capable, as equal. He'd chosen mockery instead. Now he would live with the consequences, broadcast to the world at 30 frames per second. Delphine sat in her small apartment in Hialeah, watching her phone light up like a slot machine, hitting jackpot after jackpot. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, but she couldn't bring herself to move from the worn couch where she collapsed after taking an Uber home from Atlanta. Still in her Navy coveralls, she watched herself on the television screen for the 100th time, landing Dante's jet with a precision that made aviation experts weep with appreciation. "Breaking news continues tonight," the CNN anchor announced, her expression a practiced blend of gravitas and excitement. The video of Captain Delphine McCool, who worked as a janitor for 5 years before revealing herself as a decorated Air Force pilot, has now been viewed over 50 million times worldwide. Meanwhile, Dante Caruso's business empire appears to be in freefall. Her phone buzzed again. Another job offer, this one from NetJets, promising a senior captain position with a signing bonus that would have taken her 20 years to earn pushing mop buckets. She added it to the mental pile with the others: Delta's private jet division, FlexJet, even an offer from the CEO of a tech startup who wanted his own personal pilot and didn't care what it cost. Each one more lucrative than the last. Each one requiring an answer she wasn't sure she could give. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in with the weight of sudden visibility. For 5 years, she'd been invisible, and there had been a strange comfort in that anonymity, in being able to grieve without witnesses, to survive without expectations. Now her face was everywhere, her story dissected by talking heads who knew nothing about the nights she'd spent crying in airport bathroom stalls, fighting panic attacks triggered by the sound of helicopter rotors, wrestling with the guilt that came from surviving when better people hadn't. Her laptop chimed with an email from her attorney, Jessica Chen, who'd taken her case pro bono after seeing the video. The message was characteristically direct. "Delphine, 3 more Caruso Enterprises employees have come forward with discrimination complaints. We're building a class action. Also, Dante Caruso's team has reached out about a settlement. 7 figures to make this go away. Call me. 7 figures. Enough money to never work again. Enough to disappear properly this time. Maybe buy a little house somewhere quiet where the sound of aircraft engines didn't constantly remind her of everything she'd lost and found and lost again. But then what? Another 5 years of hiding, just with better furniture? She picked up the framed photo on her coffee table, the one she looked at every night before bed. Marcus and Zara, taken just weeks before the accident. Her daughter's smile was pure sunshine, her tiny hands reaching toward the camera. Marcus stood behind her, his arms protective, his eyes full of love for the family they'd built together. "What would you want me to do, my friend?" she asked the photo, as she did most nights. The answer came not from the photograph, but from her phone. A text from an unknown number with a military area code. "Captain McCool, this is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, currently commanding the 89th Airlift Squadron. I was rocket student at flight school. Heard you're flying again. He'd be proud. If you need to talk, I'm here." Delphine stared at the message until her eyes burned. Rocket would be proud. Would he, though? Or would he tell her she was being reckless, returning to a world that had already taken so much from her? The news had shifted to showing Dante Caruso's press conference from an hour ago. He stood at a podium, his usually perfect appearance disheveled, tie slightly askew, hair not quite as perfectly styled, reading from prepared notes with the mechanical delivery of someone whose lawyers had written every word. "I deeply regret my words and actions toward Ms. McCool. I recognize that I created a hostile work environment and made unconscionable assumptions based on her position within my organization. I'm taking a temporary leave to reflect on my leadership approach and will be undergoing extensive counseling." She turned off the television. His apology meant nothing. It was damage control written by attorneys and PR experts, delivered with all the sincerity of a hostage reading a script. The real Dante Caruso was the one who'd sneered at her for 5 years, who'd only seen her worth when she held his $70 million aircraft in her hands. Her phone rang, the caller ID showing her therapist, Dr. Patricia Williams, whom she'd been seeing since leaving the military. "I saw the news," Dr. Williams said, without preamble. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know," Delphine admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "I flew again. Really flew. And it felt right, like coming home, but also terrifying, like I'd opened a door I'd spent 5 years keeping sealed. That's perfectly normal. You've just taken a massive step. The question is, what do you want to do next?" Delphine walked to her window, looking out at the Miami skyline. In the distance, she could see planes taking off from the airport, their lights blinking as they climbed into the darkening sky. For 5 years, she'd watched them from the ground. Today, she'd been among them. "Everyone wants to hire me now," she said. "Not because they suddenly discovered my qualifications, but because I'm famous. Because hiring me makes them look progressive and forward-thinking. Because I'm good publicity." "Is that necessarily bad?" Dr. Williams asked. "Sometimes the door opens for the wrong reasons, but once you're inside, you can prove yourself for the right ones." After ending the call, Delphine opened her laptop and began researching each job offer more carefully. Not just the salary and benefits, but the company culture, their safety records, their treatment of employees, their commitment to diversity beyond press releases and hashtags. If she was going to return to flying, it would be on her terms. Her phone buzzed with another text, this one from a reporter at the Washington Post. "Captain McCool, we'd like to feature you in our series on hidden talent in America's workforce. Your story could inspire others who are underemployed due to discrimination or circumstance. Interested?" She thought about all the other janitors, security guards, and food service workers she'd met over the years. People with engineering degrees from their home countries that America refused to recognize. People who spoke 5 languages but couldn't get jobs because of their accents. People who had skills and talents that prejudice kept buried. Maybe that was the answer, not just flying for herself, but flying as proof that talent existed everywhere, in every uniform, in every skin color, in every accent, in every place society had trained people not to look. She could be visible, not for fame, but for purpose. Delphine picked up her phone and scrolled to Jessica Chen's number. "Tell Dante's team, no settlement with an NDA attached," she said when her attorney answered. "I want a public trial if it comes to that. and set up meetings with the top 3 job offers, not the ones with the most money, the ones with the best cultures. It's time Captain McCool returned to the skies. As she hung up, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years. Anticipation for tomorrow. The trauma hadn't disappeared. The grief over Rocket, Marcus, and Zara would never fully fade, but it no longer owned her future. Outside her window, another plane climbed into the night sky, its lights disappearing into the clouds. Soon, she thought, soon she'd be up there again. But this time, she wouldn't be carrying just passengers. She'd be carrying the hopes of everyone who'd been overlooked, underestimated, and rendered invisible by people who couldn't see past their own assumptions. Dante Caruso stood in his empty office at 3 in the morning, watching the city lights of Miami twinkle below through floor-to-ceiling windows that had once made him feel powerful. Now they just made him feel exposed, like a specimen under glass being studied by an indifferent universe. The office that had been his kingdom now felt like a prison. On his laptop screen, the video played again. He'd watched it obsessively, frame by frame, trying to understand how he'd been so catastrophically wrong. There was Delphine handling his Gulfstream with a mastery that made his regular pilots look like amateurs. The landing in Atlanta was artwork, pure precision meeting grace. The comments below the video were less kind to him. Classic example of corporate racism and sexism. This is why we need diversity in leadership. Caruso Enterprises is going to tank, and he deserves it. Imagine all the talent he's wasted by being blind. His phone buzzed, another board member calling. He let it go to voicemail, adding it to the 23 others he hadn't returned. The merger with the Hong Kong investors was dead. They'd pulled out within hours of landing, citing fundamental concerns about corporate culture and leadership judgment. 3 major clients had already indicated they were reviewing their contracts. His empire, built over 15 years of ruthless ambition and careful cultivation, was crumbling in 15 hours. But it wasn't the financial losses keeping him awake. It was the memory of Delphine's eyes when she dropped her ID badge on the leather seat. Not angry, not vindictive, just disappointed, as if she'd expected nothing better from him, and he'd lived down to her expectations with perfect precision. Dante walked to his private bar, dark wood, crystal decanters, bottles that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He poured himself a scotch, then set it down untouched. Alcohol wouldn't fix this. Nothing would fix this. He thought about his ex-wife, Patricia, who'd left him 5 years ago. "You don't see people anymore, Dante," she'd said during their last argument, her voice more sad than angry. "You only see assets or obstacles, pieces on a board you're playing alone." He dismissed her words then, too focused on the next acquisition, the next quarter's results, the next move in games he thought he was winning. Now, standing in his empty office at an ungodly hour, he finally understood what she'd meant. Delphine McCool hadn't been a person to him. She'd been part of the background, like the furniture or the carpet or the air conditioning system. Functional, necessary, but not worthy of notice, of thought, of recognition as a human being with a story and skills and value beyond pushing a mop bucket. His laptop chimed with a new email. His assistant, former assistant, he corrected himself, since she'd resigned earlier that evening, had forwarded him Delphine's service record, leaked online by military aviation enthusiasts who'd recognize her name and call sign. He read through her commendations, her accomplishments, the glowing recommendations from generals and diplomats. She'd been trusted with the lives of the most powerful people in the country. She'd flown in combat zones where one mistake meant death. She'd commanded respect at 30,000 feet, while he'd been telling her she couldn't spell Gulfstream. The shame was physical, burning in his chest like acid. He'd built his success on claiming to recognize talent, on making smart decisions about people and opportunities. Yet he'd had one of the finest pilots in the country mopping his floors for 5 years and never noticed, never wondered, never thought to look beyond her uniform. What did that say about his judgment? What did that say about him as a human being? Dante pulled up his company's employee database, looking at it with new eyes. How many other Delphines were there? How many people had he hired for minimum wage jobs without ever wondering about their stories, their capabilities, their dreams deferred or destroyed? The janitor who always worked nights. Did he have a family? The security guard who spoke with an accent. What had she done before coming to America? The maintenance crew who kept his fleet running. What were their names, their histories, their hopes? He didn't know. He'd never asked. They'd been invisible to him, existing only to serve functions in his empire. His phone rang again. This time it was his mother calling from her retirement community in Sarasota. He almost didn't answer, but she'd keep calling until he did. She always did. Dante Anthony Caruso, she said, using his full name, like she had when he was a child in trouble. I just saw the news. How could you? Mama, That poor woman working for you for 5 years, and you never saw her worth. Her voice cracked with disappointment, which hurt worse than anger. I didn't raise you to be this kind of man. I know. Your father would be ashamed. The words hit harder than any headline, any stock price drop, any business loss. His father, who'd started with nothing and built something through respect for every person he employed, who taught him that power came with responsibility, not privilege. He started that business with respect for every worker, from the pilots to the people who cleaned the planes, his mother continued. When did you forget that? When did you become the kind of man who treats people like furniture? After she hung up, Dante sat in his leather chair, imported from Italy, cost more than most people's cars, custom designed for his frame. Everything in his office was designed to project power, success, superiority. But what was it all worth if he'd lost his basic humanity in the process? He thought about Delphine's final words to him. Talent doesn't always come in the packages you expect. She hadn't just been talking about aviation skills. She'd been talking about human worth, about the danger of assumptions, about the blindness that comes with privilege and power unchecked by empathy. Dante opened a new email and began typing. Not the carefully crafted apology his PR team had written, but something real, something that might actually matter even if it couldn't undo the damage. A letter to his board, admitting his failures, not just with Delphine, but with the corporate culture he created. Announcing he would step down as active CEO, keeping only a minority stake. The money from his divested shares would go toward establishing a scholarship fund for underrepresented pilots and aviation workers. It wouldn't fix what he'd done. It wouldn't undo 5 years of treating Delphine McCool as less than human, of creating an environment where talent was wasted and people were judged by assumptions rather than abilities. But maybe it was a start. As the sun began to rise over Miami, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Dante watched a plane take off from the airport in the distance. He wondered if Delphine was flying again, commanding another aircraft with the skill and grace he'd been too blind to see. She'd talked about trauma, about loss, about hiding from something that had broken her. Yet she'd still found the courage to step forward when it mattered, to reclaim herself even knowing the cost. He'd had every advantage in life, every opportunity. And what had he done with it? Built walls of arrogance so high he couldn't see the people on the other side, the ones who actually made his empire function. Dante sent the email to the board, then began packing his office. The scotch remained untouched on the bar. The leather chair would go to whoever replaced him. The view from the windows would inspire someone else's ambition. As for him, he needed to learn how to see people again, really see them. It was a lesson Delphine McCool had taught him at 35,000 feet, one that had cost him everything to learn. But perhaps, he thought as he placed his father's picture in a box, some lessons were worth the price, even if you paid for them in everything you thought defined your worth. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the landing that changed everything. Delphine was in the middle of a Zoom interview with Emirates Airlines when her personal phone lit up with a number she knew by heart. Caruso Enterprises' executive line. She excused herself from the interview, staring at the phone as it rang. On the fourth ring, she answered, McCool. The voice wasn't Dante's assistant or Rocco or anyone she expected. It was Dante himself, and he sounded nothing like the arrogant operator she'd known for 5 years. It's Dante Caruso. Please don't hang up. Delphine moved to her window, watching the morning traffic below. You have 2 minutes. I'm calling to offer you a position. Senior captain, full benefits, your choice of routes, a salary that reflects your actual qualifications. He paused, and she heard him take a breath. and a formal public apology from me in whatever forum you choose. The silence stretched between them. Delphine could hear him breathing, waiting. The old Dante would have filled the quiet with more talking, more persuasion, more attempts to control the narrative. This restraint was new. "You're offering me a job at the company where you humiliated me," she said finally. "Where you and your organization treated me as subhuman for 5 years. Why would I even consider that?" "Because I was wrong." The words came out raw, unpolished, without the usual calculation behind them. "Because I've spent 2 weeks examining every assumption I've ever made about people, and I found them all wanting. Because my father built that company with respect for every worker, and I corrupted his legacy. I want to fix that. But I need help, your help." Delphine sat down on her couch, the same spot where she'd watched herself become famous. "You need my help to save your company's reputation." "No." His response was immediate. "My reputation is beyond saving, and I've accepted that. I've already announced my resignation as active CEO, effective once we find a replacement. But the company employs 300 people who had nothing to do with my failures. They deserve better leadership. And you deserve the chance to fly with the respect you should have had from day one." Through her laptop screen, she could see the Emirates interviewer waiting patiently. A position with them would mean relocating to Dubai, leaving everything behind, starting completely fresh. Part of her wanted that clean break, that distance from everything that had happened. "I've liquidated my personal stake in the company," Dante continued. "20 million is going into a foundation for underrepresented aviation professionals. The board has agreed to a complete restructuring of our corporate culture with an external diversity consultant overseeing the changes. I won't be your boss. I won't even be in the building most days." "What makes you think the other employees would accept me?" Delphine asked. "They laughed when you mocked me. They watched me clean their offices for 5 years without seeing me." "Some did, yes, and several have already resigned in shame." His voice was steady, factual. "Others have reached out to the board expressing support for you and sharing their own experiences with the toxic culture I created. Maria from accounting, she told us she has a master's degree from the University of Havana. Tom from security was a police chief in Detroit before his department was defunded. People I never bothered to know." Delphine closed her eyes. She thought about Maria, who'd always smiled when they passed in the halls, who'd once shared her lunch when Delphine had forgotten hers. About Tom, who'd held doors and treated her like a human being when others barely acknowledged her existence. Good people trapped in the same invisible cage she'd been in. "The new CEO, when we hire them, will report to a board that's been restructured," Dante said. 40% diverse membership now, including Captain Sarah Mitchell from the Air Force. She spoke very highly of you, said you were the finest pilot she'd ever known. Sarah Mitchell, rocket student. The threads of her past and future were tangling together in ways she hadn't expected. "I need time to think," Delphine said. "Of course, take all the time you—" "I have conditions." She stood up, pacing now, her mind racing through possibilities. "First, I want hiring authority for all pilot positions. Second, I want a mandate to recruit from underrepresented communities with a real budget behind it. Third, the foundation you're creating. I want a seat on its board." "Done, all of it." "I'm not finished." Her voice hardened. "I want a formal investigation into discriminatory practices, not just from you, but throughout the company. Anyone found guilty of harassment or discrimination goes. No golden parachutes. No quiet resignations with severance packages." "Agreed. And I want it all in writing, reviewed by my attorney before I'll even consider meeting with you. I'll have legal drafted today." Delphine returned to her laptop where the Emirates interviewer was still waiting. "I need to go. Send the documents to my attorney, Jessica Chen." "Ms. McCool." "Delphine, wait." Dante's voice cracked slightly. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable. But I want you to know that you've changed more than just my company. You've changed me, forced me to see the man I'd become, and I didn't like what I saw. Change is easy to promise, Mr. Caruso. Living it is harder. I know, that's why I need people like you to hold me accountable." After she hung up, Delphine stared at the phone for a long moment. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was a mistake. Returning to Caruso Enterprises would mean facing the ghosts of 5 years of humiliation. It would mean working in the same hangars where she'd been invisible, flying the same jets she'd cleaned. But it would also mean something else. It would mean reclaiming those spaces on her own terms. It would mean opening doors for others who'd been shut out. It would mean turning her pain into purpose, her survival into a path for others to follow. She returned to her laptop and apologized to the Emirates interviewer for the interruption, as she continued answering their questions about her experience and qualifications. Her mind was already elsewhere, imagining a different future. One where she walked into Caruso Enterprises not as a janitor or even just as a pilot, but as a leader, where she could look Dante Caruso in the eye as an equal, or perhaps even as someone he'd have to look up to. The interview ended with Emirates offering her the position on the spot. She asked for a week to decide, knowing she was really asking for time to decide between running away and standing her ground. That night, she called Dr. Williams and talked for 2 hours about forgiveness, not for Dante, but for herself, about whether returning to the place of her humiliation was strength or self-punishment, about whether she was ready to be the symbol and leader others needed her to be. What would Captain McCool do? Dr. Williams asked. Not the janitor who hid for 5 years, but the decorated pilot who flew into combat zones. The woman who commanded respect at 30,000 feet. Delphine knew the answer immediately. Captain McCool would take the mission, no matter how dangerous, if it meant protecting others and completing the objective. The question was whether she was ready to be Captain McCool again. Fully, completely, without hiding behind any uniform except her own wings. The meeting was set for neutral ground, a quiet cafe in Coral Gables, far from both Caruso Enterprises and the spotlight that had followed Delphine for 3 weeks. She arrived early, choosing a corner table where she could see the door. Old habits from military training died hard. Always know your exits. Always control your position. Dante entered 5 minutes before their scheduled time, and Delphine barely recognized him. Gone was the perfectly styled hair, the Brioni suit, the armor of power and privilege. He wore simple khakis and a polo shirt, and carried himself with something she'd never seen in him before. Humility. Real humility, not the performance kind that powerful men sometimes affected when they wanted something. He stopped at her table, waiting. "May I sit?" She nodded, studying him as he pulled out the chair. Dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the table. This wasn't the same man who'd ruled his hangar like a king 3 weeks ago. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he began. "I'm here to discuss business, Mr. Caruso. Nothing more." "Of course." He pulled out a folder thick with documents. "Everything you requested is here. Hiring authority, recruitment, mandate, board position on the foundation. The investigation into discriminatory practices has already begun. 7 employees have been terminated so far." Delphine reviewed the papers while Dante sat in silence. Her attorney had already vetted them, but she wanted to see them herself, to understand the full scope of what was being offered. Everything she'd demanded was there, plus more. A salary that made her Emirates offer look modest. A budget for developing a diversity pipeline program. Even a provision for her to choose her own team. "This is comprehensive," she said finally. "It's necessary." He paused, then added, "The company needs fundamental change, not cosmetic fixes." He stopped, seeming to wrestle with something, then continued, "I've been seeing a therapist, Dr. James Crawford. He specializes in corporate executives who've lost their way." A bitter smile crossed his face. "First session, he asked me to name 5 janitors from my buildings. I couldn't name one. Not one person in 5 years. Delphine set down the papers. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know this isn't a performance. The man who mocked you, who couldn't see your worth, I'm trying to kill him, but it's harder than I thought. 20 years of believing success meant superiority doesn't disappear overnight." A server appeared with coffee. Delphine noticed Dante waited for her to order first, another small change from the man who'd always assumed he came first in every situation. "I've been talking to the other employees you mentioned," Delphine said. "Maria, team others, they're skeptical about these changes. They've heard promises before." They should be skeptical. I gave them no reason to trust me. Dante stared at his untouched coffee. My ex-wife called after seeing the news. She said she wasn't surprised. Said I'd been building toward this moment for years, treating people like chess pieces instead of humans. And you think hiring me fixes that? No. His response was immediate. Hiring you is just the beginning. You'll have real authority to make changes. The new CEO, when we find them, will answer to a board that includes you. Your voice won't just be heard, it'll be decisive. Delphine thought about the past 3 weeks, the job offers, the interviews, the endless possibilities. She could go anywhere, do anything. But running away felt too much like those 5 years of hiding, just in a different uniform. I have additional conditions, she said. Dante pulled out a pen. I'm listening. First, I want Marcus Roberts. He's a black pilot with 15 years experience who's been repeatedly passed over for promotion at Delta's private division. I want him as my deputy. Done. Second, the hangar where you humiliated me, I want it converted into a training facility for the diversity program. Every new hire will learn in the space where the old culture died. Dante's hands stilled for a moment, then he wrote it down. Appropriate. Third, Delphine leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. You and I will never be friends. This is a professional relationship only. You've caused me too much pain for anything else. I understand. Do you? She kept her voice level but let the steel show through. Because in your world, everything is transactional. You think enough money, enough apologies, enough changes will balance the ledger. But some things can't be bought back. The 5 years I spent hiding, the dignity you stripped away, the assumptions you made about my worth based on my uniform and my skin color, those are permanent. Dante set down his pen. For the first time since she'd known him, his eyes were genuinely vulnerable, without calculation or defense. You're right, I keep thinking in terms of deals and negotiations. Even now, trying to make amends, I'm still that person. Maybe I'll always be that person. Maybe, Delphine said, but the company doesn't have to be. That's why I'm considering this. She thought about Captain Mitchell's message, about the pilots of color watching her story unfold, about Maria and Tom and all the invisible talent waiting for someone to see them, to give them a chance. This wasn't about forgiving a Dante Caruso. It was about something bigger. I'll take the position, she said finally, but I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for everyone who's been overlooked, underestimated, and ignored. For every janitor with a degree, every security guard with a story, every person whose talents are hidden by someone else's assumptions and prejudices. Dante nodded slowly. I know. I start Monday. Full authority is outlined in these documents. Marcus Roberts comes with me. The investigation continues regardless of whom it implicates. And that marriage proposal you made as a joke, I want it on record as workplace harassment, not for legal action, but for training purposes. Every new executive will hear that story as an example of how not to treat employees. Dante's face reddened, but he nodded. It should be documented, all of it. As she turned to leave, he spoke once more. Captain McCool. She paused. For what it's worth, you're the best pilot I've ever seen. The way you flew that day, it was art. She looked back at him, her expression unreadable. I know, Mr. Caruso. That's the difference between us. I never needed you to tell me my worth. I always knew it. What I needed was for you to stop standing in the way of me showing it. Walking to her car, Delphine felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She was returning to Caruso Enterprises, but not as the hidden janitor, or even just as a pilot. She was returning as a leader, a change maker, someone who could transform the culture that had tried to diminish her. Monday would begin a new chapter. Not a setback, but a reclamation. Captain Delphine McCool was taking control, and this time everyone would see her coming. 6 months later, Delphine stood in the transformed hangar at Miami Executive Airport, watching her first class of diversity pipeline recruits perform their pre-flight checks. The space that had once witnessed her humiliation now echoed with the voices of 20 aspiring pilots, from backgrounds as varied as their dreams. Marcus Roberts, her deputy, A tall man with graying temples and 15 years of experience Delta had refused to recognize, guided a young Haitian-American woman through the cockpit procedures of a Cessna 172. His patience was evident in every instruction, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd waited too long for his own chance. Captain McCool, the board meeting starts in 15 minutes, her assistant Sandra reminded her. Sandra had been one of the ground crew who'd witnessed that fateful day, and she'd been the first to volunteer for Delphine's team. Tell them I'll be there in 10, Delphine said. I want to see Keisha complete her first solo taxi. The hangar had been completely renovated. Where mop buckets once stood, flight simulators now hummed with activity. The walls displayed photos of aviation pioneers, Bessie Coleman, Eugene Bullard, the Tuskegee Airmen, people whose excellence had persevered despite obstacles that would have broken lesser spirits. In the center, a plaque read, "Excellence has no uniform," the Delphine McCool Training Center. Dante had insisted on the name over her objections. It was one of the few battles she'd let him win. As Keisha successfully completed her taxi, bringing the Cessna to a perfect stop, the other students erupted in applause. Delphine felt pride warm her chest, not just for Keisha, but for all of them, for the future they represented. She headed to the executive conference room, the same room where she'd once emptied trash cans. Now her nameplate sat at the table. Captain Delphine McCool, Chief Pilot and Director of Diversity Initiatives. The new CEO, Patricia Yamamoto, a former Navy pilot with a reputation for transformative leadership and zero tolerance for discrimination, nodded as Delphine entered. Perfect timing. Dante just dialed in from Seattle. On the video screen, Dante appeared from his new office at a nonprofit focused on workforce development. After stepping down from Caruso Enterprises, he'd moved across the country, putting physical distance between himself and his old life. He looked healthier than she'd ever seen him. The stress lines softened, the armored expression replaced by something more genuine. "Good morning, Captain McCool," he said formally. They'd maintained professional boundaries, speaking only during board meetings and official communications. "Mr. Caruso," she acknowledged with a nod. Patricia led the meeting, reviewing quarterly reports. Caruso Enterprises' transformation had been painful but necessary. They'd lost some old clients who couldn't adapt to the cultural changes, but gained new ones attracted by their commitment to diversity and excellence. The company was leaner but stronger, its reputation rebuilt on actual values rather than hollow prestige. "The diversity pipeline program has exceeded all projections," Patricia announced. Captain McCool's recruits have a 92% completion rate, with 3 already hired by major carriers. "We're being held up as a model for the industry." Delphine felt warmth in her chest. Each success story vindicated not just her program, but her decision to stay and fight rather than run. "Dante, your foundation has approved funding for 10 more scholarship positions," Patricia continued. "Any comments?" Dante cleared his throat. "Only that the foundation board, particularly Captain McCool, deserves credit for the selection process. We're finding exceptional talent that traditional channels overlooked for years." After the meeting, Delphine returned to the hangar to find a celebration in progress. Keisha had passed her first solo flight, tears of joy streaming down her face as her classmates surrounded her with congratulations and embraces. Maria from accounting was there too, having enrolled in night classes to convert her Cuban credentials to U.S. standards. She was 3 months away from adding commercial pilot to her resume. Tom, the former police chief, now served as the program's security and logistics coordinator, his experience invaluable in managing the complex operation. "Captain McCool," Keisha ran over, still glowing with achievement. "I did it. I actually flew alone." "You did more than that," Delphine told her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You proved that talent exists everywhere, waiting for opportunity. You proved that yesterday's limitations don't define tomorrow's possibilities." Her phone buzzed with a text from Dante. She read it while Keisha rejoined her celebrating classmates. "Saw the video of Keisha's solo on the program's social media. Remarkable work. The girl you recruited from the grocery store. Cashier with an aerospace engineering degree from Haiti," Delphine replied. "She just needed someone to see past the uniform." 3 dots appeared, showing he was typing, then stopped, then started again. "Finally, I see it now, what I missed for so many years. Thank you for teaching me to look." Delphine didn't respond. Some conversations were better left incomplete. Some bridges better left partially built. Their relationship would never be friendship, but it had evolved into something functional. Mutual respect born from painful growth, maintained by careful boundaries. That evening, Delphine stood on the tarmac as the sun set, the same golden hour light that had illuminated her humiliation now blessing her triumph. A Gulfstream G650, not Dante's original, but one belonging to the program, sat ready for tomorrow's training flight. She would take Marcus and three advanced students up, showing them the complexities of jet aviation. She thought about Rocket, about Marcus and Zara, about the 5 years she'd spent hiding from herself and the world. The pain hadn't disappeared. It never would. Grief didn't work that way, but it had transformed into something useful, something that gave her pain purpose. Every student who passed through her program carried a piece of her story, proof that excellence could emerge from anywhere, that assumptions were dangerous, that talent didn't always arrive in expected packages. Sandra approached with tomorrow's schedule. You have the morning training flight, lunch with the Aviation Diversity Council, and Senator Harrison wants to discuss federal funding for programs like ours. The senator who called for congressional hearings on workplace discrimination after my story broke? The same, she says you've inspired legislation. Delphine nodded, accepting the schedule. Her life had become fuller than she'd ever imagined during those long nights pushing a mop bucket, invisible to everyone around her. She was flying again, but more than that, she was lifting others with her. As she walked to her car, no longer an old sedan, but a modest SUV suitable for transporting equipment and students, her phone rang. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell calling from Washington. Delphine, I wanted you to know we're naming the new training facility at MacDill after Rocket, the James Roberts Center for Aviation Excellence. The dedication is next month. Will you speak? I'll be there, Delphine promised, her throat tight with emotion. After the call, she sat in her car for a moment, looking back at the hangar. Through the windows, she could see her students still celebrating, their futures bright with possibility, their dreams no longer deferred. Dante Caruso had tried to clip her wings with his mockery, his casual cruelty, his marriage proposal as an insult. Instead, he'd freed her to soar higher than either of them could have imagined, to transform her pain into purpose. Captain Delphine McCool started her engine and drove toward tomorrow, where more students waited, more barriers needed breaking, and more skies beckoned. She wasn't just flying anymore. She was teaching others to fly, proving every day that the sky belonged to everyone brave enough to claim it, regardless of the uniform they wore, the language they spoke, the color of their skin. The past would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her limits. She had reclaimed her wings, and with them, she was lifting the world. One student at a time, one flight at a time, one dream at a time. The golden hour faded into twilight, and somewhere above, another plane climbed into the darkening sky, its lights blinking like distant stars. Soon, Delphine thought, watching it disappear into the clouds. Soon more would follow, and the sky would finally belong to everyone who'd been told it wasn't theirs to claim.